Hey guys, so it's been a week since my last video. Last week I essentially came to the conclusion that our society's fucked. And, not just fucked, but we're deep in it right now. Just comparing us to, the functionality of Rome, right? Best example of a, large imperial power with pseudo-global reach, that sort of idea, right? And essentially came to the point where, for basic metrics of the functionality of a society, just being able to do large projects, being able to feed the people, keep them, satisfied psychologically, physiologically, we're kind of dropping the ball. We all know it. This is the first generation that's not guaranteed to live longer than their parents by a long stretch. And the funny thing about this is that these problems are very much resolvable. It's not like we don't know about dietary. We know more than ever before, but we're being dumber than ever before because we have more options, and we also have the option of being ignorant in such a messy society, right? Because, back in the day, if you did stupid things for long enough, the consequences would bite you in the ass enough that you'd effectively be removed from functioning in society. You'd be killed. Today I was reading this interesting paper about meerkats and how they're one of the most murderous mammals of all on Earth. You're more as a meerkat, you're more likely to be killed by a meerkat than most other animals. 30% of meerkats were killed by other meerkats. Or no, it was 20%. Yes, 20% of meerkats die by the hands of another meerkat. But humans at our worst in history, let's say, during these imperial ages, yada yada, great times of war, humans have a murder rate of 30% at our worst, which makes us the most murderous species on the planet when we're having bad times. During good times, like now, it's generally much better, but the hope is that as society crumples, people don't go into murderous phases because of mass starvation, right? And how can we have starvation as a people when obesity is one of the main problems we have, right? And that's kind of become a more serious issue than you'd ever assume, because one of the problems I see nowadays is that, I'm not the only one, but nutrition has failed us en masse in a very dramatic way. We have the idea of the food pyramid, and that seems to have created this mess in the first place. Just poor information, misinformation, right? And that's when you start to see how dangerous the agents of collapse really are in this age. Because ultimately, let's say you're a Roman and you're, going about your daily diet. You couldn't eat enough bread to get fat. You'd try to get enough meat if you could. You try to get enough, you try to drink booze when you can, but there wasn't enough abundance to kill you. Or there was enough to kill one person, but not everybody. And generally speaking, the nutritional quality was high because the plants weren't being forced to grow effectively, with modern fertilizer, creating more mass but less nutrition because there's only so much that can be extracted from depleted soil. And having minerally deficient soil was not an issue that Rome had because, it was volcanic soil and ash rained everywhere for, millions of years. So there's a lot that could be depleted, so it didn't happen for a while. And with that in mind, I start seeing the psychological issues that we have as a country, but also as a global society, right? We can't do great works the same way we used to because there's too much red tape, right? And that becomes one of these like grand motivating features, because without the motivation to do great works, there's no sense of progress, there's no sense of growth. And I'm not talking about great works like a stadium. Like, in comparison to the grand population we have now, the stadiums we have are pittance, right? So we need something on a much grander scale. And with it, I sort of had to come up to like 3 main issues and 3 main solutions that come with these issues, right? And I first didn't want to be using this tablet to be talking to you guys because I'm not very good with it yet, but it's kind of becoming necessary just because I bring so much stuff up in these conversations that it just helps to have it organized, both for me and I'm guessing for anybody listening in, just because, you know, these kind of become lectures and we're all used to being talked to and having a board. So the first issue is psychology. And the minds of the masses, in terms of organizing and functioning effectively to create, you know, great works. Right now we have this massive issue with just too much bureaucracy and like oversights for our oversight committees, you know, double redundancies in decision making. It takes time, takes energy, takes money. You have to pay everybody along the scale as secondary non-producing workers to monitor and, you know, judge the effectiveness of those doing the actual labor. So the first issue we have to deal with is quite literally the soul of the nation, right? The soul of the nation is problem 1. Now, as a culture, we're becoming far more secular, right? And with that, there's some advantages. There's more tolerance of people that disagree with you. There's far more acceptance of new ideas. But with it, we also lose a lot in terms of social cohesion. We lose a lot in terms of social ability. There's no common myth anymore. There's no common thought pattern with which we create our moral sense. And superheroes kind of fall into this category, the comic book realm, and, you know, filling these spaces that help us imagine new things, greater things, better things for ourselves and for our futures. But very little of the morality is useful, you know, because these are superhumans, demi-humans. And that's one of the funny things about like the stories of Theseus and Agamemnon and just every single other one of these, you know, great historical mythical figures, because very often they function both as examples of the superhuman, but also deal with real issues that people would deal with, like Hercules, like, you know, killing his wife and children in a fit of rage, which was probably post-traumatic stress, you know. Yeah. Heracles, not Achilles, sorry, you know. Sure, granted immortality, falling into creative, you know, into a creative life of death, really, like a master of murder, so to speak, and not being granted full protection, like, from the gods, and having that mortality hang over him over the course of his life. So myth-making becomes an essential part of making any functioning, cohesive society. But the problem with myth making is that there's an idea of truth that comes with this idea of myth making that needs to then be, practical. So myth making into science. So part of this we get psychology, and modern psychology is kind of broken. Just to put it out there, it's freaking trash. It's accepted that life is suffering. I mean, even in Buddhist terminology, that sort of, nihilism is destructive to any culture that absorbs it in any true depth, because what do you do if life is just going to be suffering? In classical Greeks, in Roman times, though there's suffering in life, there's also great joys. There are feasts and festivities, and these festivities were paid for by the state, so it wasn't like there was you didn't have to pay to enjoy it. So with it comes the next issue of joy. Right. Without joy, there's no reason to live, there's no morale to keep going through the drudgery of day-to-day life. Like, people just, I hear this a lot, like the sentiment that we're just here to work till we die, and in a sense, yes, but there's so much more we can do. And all that comes to this even deeper problem with the soul of humanity right now. And that's the misery of it. And an ability to really handle and cope with it. And part of the issue is that, we live in cities, so we all lack this grit. And this was a problem that even the Romans faced. They used to, when they were talking about how they would recruit people for their militaries, they'd avoid recruiting people from the cities because they weren't used to sleeping out in the, in the cold. They weren't used to handling heavy loads for long amounts of time. People without grit took longer to train to be functional soldiers. But then if you have this issue at a societal level, people not being able to handle the turbulence of life, how do you fix that? And then without this, we have a further problem. Weakness. And I hate to say it like this, but it really is the truth, right? Because, we have issues, but we don't have the capacity to cope with sieges, Like, in ancient times, you'd have a siege for 5 to 7 years. Let's say 2 years if you were lucky, a year if you were very lucky. Your siege was short. And, you got over it. Hopefully you survived, but very often you didn't. You prepared to run. You saved your food. The food was stored at a central, location controlled by the local administrators, and it was not the best of systems, but it was more effective, because right now, pairing with this weakness idea, we have a storage capacity problem, distribution. Distribution of resources. And I'm leaving it as distribution of God, just because it kind of fits. Rather, distribution of God's grace. That's a much better way to say it. And that's where it becomes really problematic. Because, you know, it's the parable of the talents again. You know, the lucky people get more lucky and are thus able to live more comfortable lives. But eventually their luck runs out because of the hate and animosity that it creates. And by breeding hate, you then have a reason to go and kill them. So this is why, you know, billionaires fled to New Zealand. But also, you have massive security for these people. So how do you solve this? Now, if the problem is really the soul of man, let's see if a better color will work. The problem really is the soul of man. Maybe we need more power, you know, energy. So we can't use fossil fuels. And then we get to this issue of making great works, because that's one of the great motivating features for society. But then the problem becomes its own solution, right? The weakness, the lack of distribution of luck, effectively. What can we do to solve all of these? And the answer is great works of science. High tech. Now, this creates a new problem, right? Because you now have a culture of people that have to create great tech to survive. And I'm not talking, you know, great works in the time of the Romans would have been aqueducts. But we need Wi-Fi, right? Global Wi-Fi. We need power. We need information. So, with all that in mind, we've created a mess for ourselves. Because now you have a situation where we have, you know, space junk just roaming around the planet constantly. Millions of pieces, hundreds of millions. So creating a space infrastructure is very nearing a critical juncture for us, where if we don't fix it now, we won't be able to get out of this problem for another 1,000 years. We won't be able to leave the planet because there's too much junk out there, right? If 2 more satellites, 3 more satellites start colliding with each other, and as we're adding more and more satellites up there, and the oversight isn't quite as effective as we need it to be, the pollution in space makes it impossible for us to leave things in low Earth orbit anymore. So we have to create something to clean up space. So, and this starts to get kind of to this issue now. Something that would help distribute wealth and fix this problem of technology and electricity. And the best way I've seen for that is really a solar sail. Or not even a solar sail, just let's see if we can draw something for you guys here. see. Planetary grid. So this idea effectively comes down to we create a system to effectively, I keep saying that word, but that's kind of the phrase of the day right now. How do we do this effectively? It's a little ugly. Alright, that'll do. So, right now, my favorite solution for all these problems has been to create what can best be described as solar stars in space. New stars. And the point of them, they're threefold really. They handle space junk, beam information back and forth between stars, or between the constellation, you know. So you get a signal from Earth, and that signal bounces back to wherever it needs to be, back on Earth. So you effectively create a massive grid of these things and use them to be the new satellite network for the entire planet. And the point is to make them big enough to be seen, to be visible from Earth. You know, massive solar space stations. They collect light from the sun. So this will not be to scale by any means. Let's undo that and make this much brighter. Yes. So let's get this going right. So they're collecting massive amounts of light from the sun. And with it you get, you know, all the energy that the Earth could possibly need. Well, for now. So these solar rays double as sort of mitigating tools against the current mega crisis, so to speak, of global warming, because they'd be able to attenuate the sun's impact on Earth. You know, they're solar shades, but strategically placed over major cities. You know, geosynchronous orbit over these cities effectively. So they're in high orbit, but large enough to be able to be seen from Earth. So let's, you know, add some labels here, or just let's draw a few like points here. So New York. Well, actually, let's pick a new color. Though I'm pretty sure that's very visible. So. So, being in geosynchronous orbit, they're constantly able to create a shadow over whatever city that is, reducing the cooling cost for the city while harvesting a large amount of energy for the city and effectively powering them. Because you could beam energy up and down as microwaves, yes, but you can beam that energy to reservoirs off to the side of the cities. So let's, you know, let's make storage locations. So, little storage facilities, a bit off from the city, while information goes back and forth, to and from the city. So, here. This is the beautiful thing about, I picked these sorts of shapes on purpose just because they help. I mean, they're quite similar to what I envisioned these things would be like. So, you then have this constellation of space stations that are able to collect massive amounts of solar radiation, send them to storage facilities on the ground, while keeping cities beneath them cooler, right? So then, how does that help us with the general atmosphere? Because, one, you're not wasting energy cooling the city down as a whole. The entire city is under a shade, so you save that much more on, direct heating issues from the summer. And in the winter, you can move these shades off to the side. They can be moved by thrusters. They can even be used to amplify light to the city, so they improve and decrease heating costs as well. So it's a twofold benefit, heating and cooling, having solar shades, while you have the added morale of having these giant things. It's just great works, motivating the public. You get them Wi-Fi, you got them heating and cooling, and you've got energy. The great staples of modern day life, handled with one mega project. So that's one problem solved right there, right? But then you still need to, it fixes morale to a point, but not entirely. And with that, kind of come to solution number 2. You gotta fix the soul of man. And, right, just even saying something like that is incredibly conceited and quite literally, stupid. It is very stupid to try to do something like this. So, but it's one of those things that has to be done. So how do you fix this problem of just continual depression, right? Because even if we have all this energy, we haven't fixed the nutritional problem. We haven't fixed the population growth. We have not fixed just the general causes making Earth untenable for us. So as you have these facilities growing and further developing, you've got to set them up in such a way that the people in them don't starve. But unfortunately, we can't do that because thermodynamics, it's just not going to work out because there's only so much energy available in the sun that's coming to Earth, and then on Earth it's being absorbed. So we need more efficient use of the energy that's available. So how do we do this now? Well, we've got to rethink how we do agriculture entirely. And I'm not even talking about vertical farms and all that, because that's a step in the right direction. But it's very little, very late in terms of the kind of issues that we're dealing with now as a society. Because right now, let's say this is a, system. You've got mountains. Alright, one sec. You've got, mountains in the background, yada yada yada. And, the sun's there doing its thing. And, we got water. So we're trying to depict the water cycle, because right now that's probably the next biggest crisis that we have to deal with. So water, coming down from these mountains creates water that we use to then irrigate the soil, and by extension the crops that become us. That's our current system as it stands in a very crude, rudimentary way. Yada 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 yada. So the limit of the nutrition of the crops is set by the quality of the soil that the crops are growing in. And that is a limited function of how much has grown there in the past and what's growing there next in the cycle, right? So we have the issue of the best food for us not being the best food that people want to consume. The problem is one of taste, because in theory now you have this crop system, this, you know, the way we've done crops for millennia, and they have pests, so we need pesticides. So you spray them, and those pesticides make us sick, which, you know, creates this inflammatory response that makes us depressed, and sure, we're fed, but we're miserable. Yeah. So then a second issue becomes this inflammatory response that we're then fighting against, right? And, you know, food insecurity, because we can only produce so many crops at one time. We create, you know, silos. One, not just to store the grain, but also to act as facilities where we can grow crops in a more space-efficient manner. So, you know, one single unit of land can, you know, be seen here containing multiple times the amount of grain we possibly could, or whatever crop you choose to grow in these spaces, right? So, yeah. And, you know, you can have greater diversity and all that, but these are effectively vertical greenhouses. And the problem becomes then fertilizing this land, because, you know, we still have farms, we still have needs for meat, all that stuff, plant matter, organic matter. So as it stands, you still have normal farms, and like the drawings for these are going to be kind of horrific, but we're going to do our best. So, where's, oh, there it is. Yeah, for happy cow. Or rather, this feels like more of a bison. So, everybody's anyway, these guys poop. Massive amounts. And generally the poop is, you know, left on the ground to go to waste. Which is, you know, my version of a joke, but yada yada. Because it's impossible to monitor them, right now we have factory farms, so cows are kept in corrals. They don't really get to move as much as we'd like them to, and the use of things like the Bessemer process to, you know, nitrogenate the soil removes the need of the poop directly. And with that, we also have the effective use of these processes to move water into these silos and, you know, not just irrigate the soil, but also irrigate these aquaponic systems. So let's get some water going. So in addition to pooping, drinking, we're irrigating soils. Here, start to see the efficiency of these methods come to light. Right? You pump the water from the ground. High. The plants use them. But now we start to see the real potential of these systems. Because now, if we have the water from, let's say, an irrigation trough, not an irrigation trough, an animal feed trough, right? And we're consistently washing the dirty water from there out. Sorry, my cursor's a little hard to see right now. So, the effective hope here is that we take, you know, non-potable water and feed them into hydroponic systems that would generally take clean water. So, water that's been already post-processed by the animals. So we wouldn't want this so much in regular planting methods just because, one, it's filthy, two, it's a mess of a biological disaster, so to speak, having people move through those farms. But because we can now sterilize this, you know, sterilizing the poop before you push it into these facilities. That's one of the beautiful things about this. Having a facility sterilizing all the fecal matter from the plants, from the animals, waste product, before they go in. So you have sterile but nutrition-rich fluid, effectively, you know, helping fertilize the plants and keep the nutrition levels high. And having this be a paired project that goes with human waste as well. And that means reworking our entire city, you know, waste grid system. So that becomes a secondary intent of all this in terms of creating more efficient, you know, city planning and all that. So now these cities have their waste, rather than going into, I mean, this already happens to an extent, but we do too much dumping and not enough recycling of our waste. And having humans being the largest source of biomass on Earth, we can do this far more effectively, right? So now we have this dual issue that gets created by this as well, because we need feed for the animals, and that's where most of our agriculture goes to now. I think it's like I think it's 2/3 of our agricultural output goes to animal feed, and making smart animal feed decisions means we have better options in terms of keeping our people alive, right? So how do we make smarter feed decisions in such an environment? And we need better animals, because right now this isn't original thinking. It's the idea is to use like goats. One, because they take a shorter amount of time to develop and are more resource efficient. But we need more options, because remember, we're still gonna have those facilities in space. So let's get one of these guys up there. And now they're beaming energy, they're beaming Wi-Fi down. Wait, no, let's get this color right. Alright, so they're beaming two sorts of things now. Energy, let's keep that as purple. And we can store those at the top of the mountains. And this is on purpose. So, energy to one place. Light. Okay, it's not even light. Let's make Wi-Fi. So, pure radiological energy. One realm. Light for the plants. And then signals for humans. So let's change the light. Light for the plants. And signals for the humans. So I'll eventually get better at this, but okay. So you have three sorts of signals being stored and pass around. The light focusing for the agricultural projects allows us to keep, these, greenhouses hyper productive, and we can also increase the CO2 storage in these facilities just by channeling. I would hate to create domes over cities, but we can create air filtration in these cities to help capture carbon. So, on top of every building, get a carbon sink. Yeah. So we partly create this carbon economy. It then goes back to help feeding our food, but also keeping the output of our energy low. So then how do we deal with storing in transit? Because that's another big source of the carbon emissions that we're now trying to mitigate as a mass. Because, one, we have, the constellation of systems up there, but two, we have the very real necessities on the ground that need to be taken care of to help us manage this whole crisis. And with this comes this problem of effectively forcing in these growth facilities to be as close to the cities as possible, which starts to make it a lot more feasible to do all this together, because you're having the focus be in very tight ranges. So even though it looks like the beam is going to very different places by the very geometry of the planet, right? It's all within a very small relative area to one another. So let's see if we can get this done right. So, you know. So here's a miniaturization we had before. And the sun, you know, same sun, yada yada yada. Probably closer to scale now. But, you know, you've got signals bouncing around the planet while these, you know, giant infrastructural mega projects do all the collecting for regional habitats for the people there. So then the question becomes, how do you build these things feasibly, you know? Because the price of moving any amount of matter into space is exorbitant. So that's when you start to look at new ways of constructing things in space. And my favorite right now is to actually use a particle beam. So, here. And this is going to be one of those extra crazy ideas. Right. Probably should save these photos for later, but honestly, it's not worth it. So now we've got this problem of how we're going to build these structures. Yeah. Earth being mostly, I think you may hear my cat. Earth being mostly water. We do not have the resources to really, you know, move matter into space without burning fuel, which defeats the whole process because the cost of moving that much material to orbit would heat up our planet, especially if we're burning rocket fuel to do it, right? We gotta find energy efficient ways of getting this material up there. So, why don't we just use, you know, something simple? So now we can create something like a small satellite network. Already, you know, something small around these areas, critical points. Right, around the Earth. Now I just put up 6. So, on Earth, you then have a series of these. Let's call them boilers. Actually, boilers are a great idea. And their job is very simple. To use nuclear energy. There are nuclear reactors floating over the ocean. And this is where it gets kind of insane, to be honest, but like, the logic is there. It just takes, it's an investment of energy to gain access to much more energy. So their job is to take energy from the Earth effectively in the form of nuclear energy, heat up and ionize beams of water. And yes, I said beams of water. But not just beams, like these are particle beams we're talking right now. But hydrogen and oxygen. And effectively grow massive crystals in the sky. Oops, wrong. Oh, this is annoying. There you go. Isn't this thing working? Alright, it's there. That should have to double click. Huh. So from these facilities, you get these crystals that grow in space under pressure. So how do you keep the crystals? You know, these are water crystals that we're trying to grow here in orbit. So the conditions you need are a decent amount of atmospheric pressure and a decent amount of, well, I mean, that's the main issue right now, is the atmospheric pressure, and being able to maintain that in space becomes the issue. And then once the pressure is dissolved, you then have them sublimating to create gas tails. So it's a twofold effort, right? And the materials you need to do this are very much like a graphene. So that begins to create the, tells us what conditions the initial satellites that go up need to be in. They're effectively graphene nets that we then double click. Yes. Yeah, little graphene nets. They grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow to give us, these stars. And having them stay under pressure, you can then sink the heat away from them to keep them cold, and then use the graphene to move the energy into a focus beam to then be sent back to Earth through the process. So you're able to keep the water, cool the water, because you're beaming them up in, high energy particle beams of hydrogen and oxygen that then react inside the graphene net. So it's a graphene heat sink put into space that's creating a pressure bubble. And, the pressure bubble effectively makes conditions useful for actual work. So, you can get into the details of how to do this. I guess this is why I've been so obsessed with spirals today, right? So, you effectively beam energy into these spirals. Water condenses within them. And then from the condensation of water, the crystal grows around. Yeah, it's released. And this allows us to effectively grow space habitats for humanity that can then be given, rotational gravity as you can excavate out these hollows, and if this facility is now turning, you can create a hollow floor inside these spaces. Let's see if I can get this done right. So you have different gravitational zones within a structure like this, with lower and lower gravity the further in you go. And then 0 gravity at the center. And, you know, you're aiming the particle beam at the center where there's 0 gravity, and then using the floors to effectively push the crystallizing water out and suck the heat out of it, so the facility stays warm and the outer edges of it are cool. So it corresponds with the, you know, coloring scheme that I used here. You know, it's cooler on the outer edges, but higher gravity on the outer edges. You can use it for storage. You can use it for, you know, accelerating objects out away from the spinning facility, and that way these satellite systems then become not just ways to send signals back and forth to the Earth, but also ways of sending objects to one another. Yeah. So here, let's get another one going. And it's now easier to move things into orbit because of it. I'm still getting a hand of this. So we still, you know, still have the information passing between them. To any facility, to anywhere on Earth, really, because it's just a matter of getting the focusing right on where these signals go, and you know, you can pick your target location by, you know, reference image of where you want it to go. And so energy comes from the ground to seed water on these things, and the nice thing about using water as a building material in space is that it's great if you're ever getting attacked, you know, by aliens with lasers or whatever. But, you know, it forms useful crystals, and the useful crystals can then be used to do anything as far as, like, energy storage, radiation storage. And the nice thing about ice in particular, especially ice that's been impregnated with something like carbon nanotubes, is that it's dual crystalline structure, so it's the ice crystals help create a lattice within which the carbon nanotubes form more stably, and they reinforce each other, so it becomes like a cold sort of ice. So it becomes sort of this feasible system for maintaining planetary homeostasis, just because, you know, we've got human effort being directed to regulating the very problems that we have on Earth. And the nice thing about having these things being made out of ice is that if they fall to Earth, you know, it's just rain, right? It's rain and carbon dioxide. There's very little to worry about in terms of, like, long-term problems that happen when, like, these things eventually, like, inevitably get taken down by gravity or mismanagement or just abandonment in general. And then we've got not just the soul, but the spirit of humanity that needs to be dealt with now. And this is where we get to dealing with the religious issues of what it means to be humans, because these are mega projects in the most literal of terms. Like, these will be the biggest things humanity has ever constructed. But in the process of doing so, we will have become, like, lords of our own domain, right? And we're gonna need a belief system to reflect this. Like, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done, thy kingdom on earth as will be in heaven. You know? it can become. So the idea of the broader human, I think one of the best terms I've heard for this was the ecumene, which is this idea of the human-controlled space. But even in the greatest of sci-fis, I've never seen anything try to approach this level of organization in terms of handling the resource needs of the planet. Because we're not just feeding the planet in this way, we're powering the planet, and we're constantly storing excess energy in the form of rotational energy, by moving the energy off planet. Because that's kind of one of the beautiful things about this, because immediately these sorts of structures can be used for harvesting many times the energy of what it took to build them. But they would have to have an initial cost in probably the trillions, to be honest. But I think it'd be worth it, because the beauty of the Roman aqueduct system, I mean this is literally a newfangled aqueduct. We're moving water from low to high in effect, and this water then that's moved into high Earth orbit we can use to seed further development in space. You then have massive reservoirs of water for communities to use in orbit, and then moving humanity into orbit. Because the nice thing about having these lifting beams that are sending the water into orbit is that you then have, let's see if we can get this drawn on top of this. Oh, wait. You can have, let's say, something like a balloon, right? And with it, you then have, need to remember to double click. Wow. There we go. So you've got, your little blimp or whatever, and it's going on a path around the world. In the process, must cross a bunch of these beams. And as you cross ahead of these beams, the orbit goes higher and higher. And it becomes a tool for getting into Earth orbit. Just by, it's simple geometry, really. Is the same technology that we'd use for solar lifters, because now the particles in the beam have mass, and it's a slowly spiraling trajectory outward from the planet. So here, let's give a better description. Right, I keep saying I'm getting the hang of this thing, but I think I finally got it. So double click, and now paint the trajectory of one of these objects. So you're starting in the atmosphere, and you collect energy from these beams as you move around the planet rather fast, and you work your way outward, collecting energy. You're not at orbital speeds yet, but you're getting higher and higher. And then to break into orbit, you do a death spiral in, and then gravitationally use a slingshot effect to push you into higher orbit, and then repeat the process again and again until you have enough velocity to escape. So it becomes a whole global infrastructural system. You know, the lifters on the ground and the collectors in the air, all acting as a sort of radiation management system that doubles to, you know, support the growing infrastructure on the planet. Because right now, like, even the, you know, nuclear reactors at sea don't have to be nuclear reactors. Just if you want to do this as efficiently and quickly as possible, you'd want them to be reactors. But this could all be done with, you know, renewable energy, harvesting energy from the mechanical energy of the waves, you know. And so you put these in the roughest seas possible. Rough seas, rough seas, rough seas. And with that, you know, that energy, which is a massive amount, but it's inefficient to harvest it all. But it's got its advantages. Yeah. I just like to keep things nuclear just because it's fewer things to worry about. And wave energy hasn't really been perfected in terms of how we harvest it, you know. But yeah, this is kind of the general gist of how to save the planet. I'll get into more details with all that's involved, but having the satellite array and the lifter system on the ground allows us to move to not only support larger cities, keep our cities cooler, you know, give humanity hope, something to look up to, you know, look forward to. It gives humanity a trajectory outward from Earth without wasting insane amounts of energy to create rockets. And one of the the name of the game is efficiency when you're dealing with a scale of 7 billion, right? This doesn't need to be fast, it just needs to be efficient so we don't burn this energy up in the atmosphere and destroy ourselves. And I mean, the worst I could see happening with this is that we damage the ozone layer by beaming, but again, you're still beaming up ozone, which is, you know, ionized oxygen. So beaming up ionized oxygen and hydrogen kind of, you know, you're seeding the ozone layer again. So especially if you have diffusers, you know, you can build little, so I mean, this is kind of science just digging its own way out of the hole that it's created for ourselves. So you can build like little suborbital diffuser balloons that work to capture some of the sunlight. Yeah. So let's see, have it here crossing the beam. Don't cross the beams. Yada yada. So these can diffuse some of that oxygen, some of the gases selectively to help rebuild the ozone layer in parts. You know. And in theory, we should be losing water on Earth anyway, as the planet cools down. So this allows us to kind of take water back from Earth. I mean, it's not like we have the energy to reheat the planet up and release some of the energy in the rocks in the Earth. So this gives us a method for sort of forestalling the inevitable, you know, loss to entropy. I mean, I can go deeper, but I mean, I kind of want to because this is much more hopeful than last time, but I'll save it for another day. Anyway, guys, thanks for listening. If you made it this far, kudos.